let's first recap the Generation Dragenesis set by going over the top 5 decks of this format. Just like my last top 5 video, I'll not be talking about the collab decks as we still don't know when the English side will be getting them. But do note that both Love and Berry are definitely two of the most represented decks in the Japan side. Even though I don't personally like their design, I still hope they get imported sometime soon to keep the other top dogs of Rezael and Levidras in check. Coming in at number 5, I have Blangdmire. Even though I think this is definitely a tier below the two best decks of the format, its divine skill can really catch people off guard. Also, having an attacker that can swing with an extra crit 2 times in a turn is very threatening. I personally like to play the deck with Sagacious Schemer and the Order as this makes Veydrop Dragon a booster and not something that can easily be retired in the front row. The way you beat this deck is to guard early. You make their divine skill turn less lethal if you start perfect guarding the attacks prior, because the players will want to counterblast for a lot of their effects, such as Zamu to deck thin and evoke Alchemist for the 4th attack. They will eventually run out of resources or deck out because their turns after the divine skill is relatively easy to guard. And here's a simple deck list. At number 4, I have Odium. The number that this deck can produce is just insane. You can reliably get at least 2 Distorted Banes as regress gauges thanks to average rester and just the amount of cards you draw, from Philia and Elmatic Colossus, your energy cyclers, and more. You would think that because you can Persona Ride on your extra turn, the numbers won't be that large, but because of Odium's effect, your Anachronos Dragon and Valpratia are still huge. This deck without the extra turn is a 3-attack deck, meaning the perfect guards are your best friends. And even though drawing a lot of cards is great at finding pieces and making sure you survive, it also brings you very close to deck out. The deck also lacks in shield value. Going aggro early may force the opponent to dish out important pieces. And here's a simple deck list. At number 3, I have my personal deck of this format, Messiah. This deck grinds your opponents out. As long as you have enough soul, you replenish your hand with even more attackers for next turn, as well as cards to help you stay alive. One of the best new additions has to be the new effect fronts that go into soul after guarding. Just think of it as a defensive card that draws you 1 extra card next turn. With Lady Battler of the Black Dwarf in the mix, we can get off 5 attacks much easier now as it's an additional unit that locks itself after battle. The weakness of this deck is quite obvious. It has no early game at all. Decks that can pressure you early on or play the grade 2 game will completely expose Messiah. And even on first stride turn, the numbers aren't that big. Lady Battler is only hitting for 10k and the rest are only for 15. And honestly, there are a lot of pieces that the Messiah player has to find for the stride turn, or they would just be hitting for even weaker columns. And here's a simple deck list. And now we move on to the 2 best decks of the format, and in my opinion, these are a tier above the other decks that I mentioned. At number 2, I have Rezael. The strength of this deck is its deck filtering options with Saragon and Cadwalla early on in the game. Rezael has an incredibly aggressive turn 2 that fills the hand with more pieces for next turn. And with Rezael's skill, you can easily recur them every turn to deck thin more. You just hit your crits so often because of this, as well as from the crits you shuffle back with Rezael's divine skill. One of the weaknesses of this deck is its reliance on finding Saragon. Without it, the deck is very slow at finding the other pieces. One thing you can do is to choke your opponent at certain damages. You don't want to give your opponent access to 3 damage for easy grade 2 in 1 column, and sometimes when they hit a defensive, it's better to swing at rearguard, so they don't get the additional effect on Gabalius with 4 damage. And here's a simple deck list. And finally, in my opinion, the best deck of this format is Levidras. What makes this deck so powerful is the amount of card advantage you get from the Infinity Eyes markers it generates. Every one of them on the opponent's side is a 10k shield that draws you a card, and every marker on your side asks for an additional 10k shield from the opponent. Also, the deck's capability to build a board out of nowhere thanks to cards like Huli and Aspronia is so hard to beat. You also have a great attacker in Sharmnet that draws a card and clears itself to make room for Squirrel, either as an additional attack or a huge booster. The weakness of this deck is that it needs to find a lot of pieces early on. Ideally, you want to be tucking in a Levidras into soul every turn for the additional marker. And because a lot of the cards in the deck requires 3 markers on board, finding at least 1 Levidras for turn 3 is very important. So pushing early on so that you are forcing your opponent to guard with important pieces may be your path to victory. And here's a simple deck list. And those are my opinion on the top 5 decks of the set 6 format. Do you think I missed the deck? There are honestly a lot of other contenders, such as Varga, Ava, and Chronojet, that didn't quite make my list. Even though the top 2 decks do stand out as the best decks of the format, I do enjoy being able to play a lot of different decks and still be able to compete.